Imagine a world where stepping on land meant almost certain death, a world where giant insects ruled the forests, and the oceans were the only true sanctuary. This was the Carboniferous, over 300 million years ago, a forgotten age when the very air itself created monsters. The air was heavy, richer than ours today, nearly 35% oxygen. Every breath fed fire. Every breath allowed life to swell into forms beyond imagination. The forests were alive with predators larger than birds, larger than cats, creatures born not from fantasy, but from the sky itself. On the ground, shadows moved. Millipedes longer than a man, scorpions the size of cats, spiders weaving webs across entire trees. Each step was danger. Each breath was risk. To walk this land was to enter a nightmare, a world where survival itself seemed impossible. If you enjoy calm journeys into forgotten ages, give this video a gentle like. It helps others find their way to this quiet corner of history. Now, take a deep breath and let us step deeper into the Carboniferous, where the swamps were endless and the monsters waited at every turn. The Carboniferous world was wrapped in endless swamps. The air was heavy with moisture, pressing against the skin like a damp blanket. Towering club mosses and tree ferns rose higher than houses, their crowns blocking the sun. The ground beneath them was soft and unstable, a thick carpet of rotting leaves. The smell of decay was constant, sweet and sickly, clinging to every breath. This was not a gentle forest. It was a living greenhouse where heat and humidity never rested. Each step sank slightly into the mire. Each movement echoed with the buzz of unseen wings. Life thrived here in impossible abundance, but it was never peaceful. Even the plants seemed menacing, their twisted trunks and sprawling roots creating a labyrinth where shadows stretched and silence felt dangerous. Light in this ancient world was fractured. Sunbeams struggled to pierce the roof of leaves. What little brightness slipped through was filtered into ghostly beams that danced in the mist. The swamp became a maze of shadows, where sight was weak and sound carried far. Every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. Every ripple in the water seemed like a signal that something moved nearby. For the earliest creatures who dared to crawl here, the forest was overwhelming. Their senses were drowned by endless layers of smell, sound, and shadow. The ground was unstable, the air thick, and the plants rose like walls. This was not just a habitat. It was a trap built by nature itself. And in this suffocating green maze, predators waited in silence, ready to strike from every side. To breathe here was not easy. The air felt heavier, thicker than our own. Oxygen was abundant, nearly 35%, far more than our lungs could endure. For the animals of this time, it was both a gift and a curse. It fueled growth to monstrous sizes, but it also turned the entire forest into a tinderbox, ready to ignite with a single spark. Imagine a storm rolling overhead. Lightning cracks across the sky, and suddenly the swamp bursts into flame. Fire roars through the canopy, devouring miles of forest at once. Yet the dampness always returned, regrowing what had been burned. Destruction and rebirth were woven into the rhythm of the land. For the creatures who lived here, survival meant learning to exist in a world that could smother or burn them in the same breath. The Carboniferous forest was never still. It burned, it drowned, and it grew again. Firestorms would sweep across the swamps, devouring everything in their path. Yet within weeks, green life returned. New shoots pushed through the ash. Towering trunks rose again. The cycle of destruction and rebirth was endless. For the creatures here, survival meant adapting not only to predators, but to the land itself. The forest was both enemy and ally. It gave food and shelter, yet it could vanish in a single blaze. This unstable rhythm shaped every step, every breath. Life was forced to live in constant readiness, for safety never lasted long. The swamp forests seemed eternal, but their shadows hid more than plants. Beneath the canopy, strange forms stirred. Creatures larger than birds, heavier than cats, waited in silence. Their bodies were armored, their legs too many, their eyes like shining beads in the dark. To walk deeper into this forest was to enter their domain, and with every cautious step, a question lingered in the air. What horrors ruled this green labyrinth, and how had the very air itself turned insects into monsters? The answers await in the next chapter. The air of the Carboniferous was different, richer, heavier, almost overwhelming. Nearly 35% of it was oxygen, far more than we could survive today. For plants, it was fuel. For animals, it was transformation. This invisible force reshaped life in ways we can barely imagine. It was not just air, it was the engine of monsters. Unlike mammals, insects do not breathe with lungs. Instead, they draw oxygen through delicate tubes inside their bodies, called trachea. In our world, this limits their size, but in an atmosphere swollen with oxygen, those tubes carried more air than ever before. Oxygen reached deep into their tissues, turning tiny ancestors into giants. It was nature pushed beyond balance, a world where air itself became a weapon. Insects of this time grew into shapes that feel unreal today. Dragonflies with wings as wide as hawks, millipedes longer than humans, spiders weaving webs strong enough to hold small animals. None of this was fantasy. It was the direct result of breathing air so rich that their bodies expanded to the edge of possibility. Every generation stretched the limits further. Mandibles grew sharper, legs heavier, wings broader. The atmosphere was like a forge, building predators at terrifying speed. To live here was to live surrounded by creatures that did not just survive oxygen. They thrived on it, growing stronger, stranger, and far more dangerous than anything that crawls today. For plants and arthropods, oxygen was a gift. For fragile vertebrates, it was a curse. Early amphibians stepping onto land-faced air that poisoned their lungs. Breathing too deeply could burn from within. The forest floor became a paradox, filled with life, yet hostile to every breath. This was a world where survival meant adapting or retreating back into the water. Even fire fed on this abundance. Lightning could turn miles of forest into a furnace. Flames burned hotter, brighter, and faster than in our world. To live in such an atmosphere was to face danger not only from the predators, but from the very sky. Oxygen made giants possible, but it also made survival fragile. It was both creator and destroyer. In this strange world, size was not a matter of chance. It was written in every breath. Insects that today would fit in the palm of your hand grew to lengths as long as your arm. Dragonflies soared with wings wide as hawks. Millipedes became living walls of armored legs. The forest floor trembled beneath their weight. These creatures were not rare curiosities. They were the rulers of their time. Their size gave them dominance over every corner of the land. They hunted with patience and power, their movements amplified by an atmosphere that poured energy into every muscle. In the Carboniferous, air itself created kings. But the skies were only part of the story. The true nightmares lurked beneath the canopy, crawling across the damp forest floor. Creatures with armored plates, stingers, and countless legs claimed the shadows as their hunting ground. And so, as we move deeper into this world, a question rises. What did it mean to share the land with scorpions the size of cats and centipedes longer than men? The answer lies ahead, in the crawling horrors of the next chapter. Among the most unsettling rulers of the forest floor was Arthropleura, a millipede-like creature longer than a grown human. Its body was covered in armored plates that shimmered in the damp light. It moved like a living tank, countless legs scraping in eerie rhythm against the rotting leaves. Even though it fed mostly on decaying plants, its presence was terrifying. Imagine walking through the swamp and hearing that endless scraping sound, echoing like a warning. The sight of its glistening armor sliding through the shadows would chill even the bravest heart. In this forest, even harmless giants carried the weight of dread. Not all crawlers were harmless. Giant scorpions prowled the swamp floor, some as large as modern cats. Their pincers snapped with crushing force, and their tails curved above them, tipped with venomous stingers. These hunters moved with patience, blending into the gloom until it was too late for their prey. For small amphibians daring to crawl on land, a single encounter could be fatal. The sting was not just pain, it was death delivered in silence. To picture such a predator in the humid darkness is to imagine shadows alive with danger. The forest floor was never still, never safe, and always waiting with new threats. The terror of the Carboniferous was not found in distance, but in closeness. Unlike dinosaurs that came later, these predators lived underfoot, behind every leaf, within every shadow. They were not rare monsters. They were everywhere. Every step risked brushing against armored plates or silken webs. For creatures living here, survival was claustrophobic. The ground, the trees, even the air itself felt alive with movement. You could not escape the presence of crawling giants. To exist in this time was to be surrounded, trapped in an ecosystem that offered no space to breathe. It was fear woven into daily life. Above the swamp floor, vast webs stretched from trunk to trunk. Each thread glistened in the mist, strong enough to catch more than insects. These were not the delicate webs of our time. They were snares woven to trap amphibians, even small reptiles daring to step onto land. The hunters that made them lurked nearby, waiting with patience as old as time. Their many eyes shimmered in the gloom, watching for movement. A single vibration could bring rushing legs, dripping fangs, and silence. The forest itself became a net, where every step risked becoming a final mistake. If this journey fascinates you, take a moment to subscribe. It helps bring more of these quiet stories of forgotten worlds to life. Every click supports the next step into history's shadows. But here, in the Carboniferous, shadows were not enough. The true terror spread its wings above the forest. Dragonflies larger than hawks filled the skies, hunting with unmatched speed. If the ground was crawling with danger, the air was no sanctuary either. So let us rise now, and face the rulers of the sky in the next chapter. Above the swamp canopy, shadows darted across the mist. These were not birds. They were dragonflies, called Meganura, with wingspans as wide as hawks. Their wings shimmered in the humid light, slicing through the air with power unmatched by any insect today. Each beat of their wings carried them swiftly across the ancient forest. They hunted not in silence, but in dominance. Every movement precise, every dive a strike. To see them was to witness the sky itself turned into a hunting ground, alive with speed and menace. Meganura were more than wings. Their eyes were vast, taking up nearly their entire heads. They saw in fragments, 1,000 images merging into a single awareness. Nothing escaped their gaze. A trembling leaf, a flicker of movement, even the faintest ripple in the air. With this vision, they ruled the skies. Prey had no chance of hiding. Amphibians, small insects, even the weak and wounded, none could escape their endless watch. Imagine walking through the forest, knowing that above you, countless eyes searched every shadow. The sky itself had turned into a predator. They were hunters without equal. With wings wide and strong, they darted through the swamp like arrows loosed from the sky. Their jaws snapped shut with crushing force, tearing apart prey in mid-flight. No creature was safe once they had taken aim. For the creatures of the Carboniferous, the ground was dangerous, but the sky was worse. The buzzing above was not harmless sound. It was the warning of a predator closing in. Even the silence between wing beats carried menace, a pause before the strike. To live beneath their domain was to live with no safe direction. Flight in the Carboniferous was more than movement. It was domination. Meganura ruled the skies with speed that turned the air into a weapon. Their wings beat with a steady hum, a sound that announced both power and fear. Small insects scattered at their shadow. Amphibians froze beneath the canopy, hoping to escape notice. But there was no escape. These rulers of the sky hunted with precision, striking from above, tearing prey from branches, and vanishing into the mist before silence returned. Yet even the masters of the air could not escape the dangers below. For the swamp was also a place of webs. Webs vast and strong, spun by creatures waiting in silence. As Meganura dominated the skies, others prepared their traps among the trees. The balance of fear was never steady. The question remained: if the skies were ruled by predators and the ground by crawlers, what lay hidden in the shadows between? The answer awaits in the next chapter. In the Carboniferous swamps, the trees were not only walls of wood, they were pillars tied together with endless strands of silk. Webs stretched across branches, dripping with mist and glowing faintly in the dim light. Entire groves became cages spun by patient hunters. To walk among these forests was to step into a trap. A brush against a thread sent vibrations echoing through the air. And somewhere, hidden in the gloom, 8 legs stirred, waiting, listening, ready to strike. The forest itself was stitched with silk, a snare for the unwary. The spiders of this time were not the small creatures we know today. They were giants, hunters whose webs could stretch wider than a man's reach. Each silk strand was strong, shimmering like steel in the humid air. They built in silence, weaving traps that blended seamlessly into the forest. Prey never saw them coming. A single misstep, a broken thread, and the hunter would emerge. Fangs glistened with venom, eyes shining like beads of glass. They were silent architects, rulers of stillness, whose empire stretched across the canopy. Theirs was a kingdom built on patience and precision. For small creatures, the forest was not just full of predators. It was a labyrinth of invisible traps. Webs stretched across paths, low among the roots, high above the ground. Everywhere was danger. There was no corner of the forest free from the reach of silk. To survive meant moving with caution. Every step tested, every shadow feared. The webs turned the swamp into a prison, where freedom could vanish in a heartbeat. To live in the Carboniferous was to live with the certainty that the forest itself conspired against you, that every step forward might be your last. When prey touched a thread, the silence ended. 8 legs rushed forward, fangs glistening with venom. These hunters did not roar or chase. They waited, and then they struck. A single bite delivered stillness, wrapping the victim in silk until it vanished into the shadows. To witness this was to see patience rewarded with cruelty. The webs were more than homes. They were weapons, stretching across the forest like invisible traps. And the spiders themselves were the executioners, cloaked in mist, ruling their kingdom with silence and fear. But the crawlers of silk were not the only beings testing the land. In the same shadows, another struggle had begun. Fragile amphibians, pulled between water and soil, risked their lives with each step away from the safety of the swamps. The forest floor was already a trap of webs and predators. Yet these early pioneers dared to breathe, to crawl, and to claim a space on land. Their struggle asks us a question. How could such fragile forms survive in a world of monsters? The answer lies ahead in the next chapter. In the Carboniferous world, some creatures dared to leave the water. They were fragile amphibians, their skin thin, their bodies heavy, their movements clumsy. Yet they stepped onto the forest floor, pulled by the promise of food and safety. But this land was no gentle refuge. It was a place ruled by monsters, filled with crawling giants and firestorms that could end whole forests. Each step out of the swamp was a gamble. Yet without that gamble, life would never have reached the paths that led to us. Their lungs struggled to breathe the heavy air. Their skin dried quickly under the humid canopy. Every moment on land was a fight against weakness. Yet still they climbed over roots, pushed through leaves, and sought insects for food. For predators, these pioneers were easy prey. Their small bodies and slow movements betrayed them. Many did not survive, yet a few endured, finding shelter in shadows, hiding near water, and learning how to live in both worlds. These fragile beings were the first bridge between water and earth. For amphibians, the swamp was safety, but also a prison. On land, dangers waited at every step, yet food and new opportunities called them forward. They lived between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. Their journey was the beginning of something greater. For from these hesitant steps would come creatures that no longer needed water, creatures that would carry life into deserts, mountains, and beyond. But here, in the Carboniferous, each attempt to climb ashore was still a story of struggle, loss, and rare survival. Each breath on land was dangerous. The air, rich in oxygen, could burn fragile lungs. The dampness of the swamp was a shield, but on the forest floor, skin cracked and bodies weakened. For many amphibians, survival lasted only moments beyond the water's edge. Yet those moments mattered. In the brief lives of these pioneers, nature was testing possibilities. Some fell, others endured. From their struggle, the path forward slowly opened. Their weakness was real, but so was their courage. They were the price paid for evolution's future. If you are enjoying this calm journey, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Would you have dared to step onto this dangerous land? Your thoughts help keep these stories alive, and I love reading them. But here in the Carboniferous, survival was more than curiosity. Amphibians stood at a crossroads. Some would vanish back into the water. Others would take the risk and stay. And from those choices, a new kind of creature would rise, one that no longer needed water. The reptiles are coming, and they will change everything. The Carboniferous forest was alive, but it was also fragile. Every tree was a tower of dry fibers, every leaf a piece of tinder. The air, swollen with oxygen, made even damp wood eager to burn. In this world, a single spark was enough to change everything. Imagine the silence of the swamp, heavy and wet. Then, in an instant, lightning tears across the sky. A crack echoes, and suddenly the forest explodes with fire. Flames race along branches, climbing trunks, leaping from tree to tree. For miles, the land glows red. The swamp transformed into a furnace of heat and ash. When firestorms began, they were not like the fires we know today. They moved faster, burned hotter, and lasted longer. The air itself fed the flames, turning the swamp into a living torch. Creatures tried to flee, but where could they go? The ground was soaked, the canopy a roof of fire, and the smoke filled every breath. Survival meant retreating into the water, burying deep in mud, or vanishing into hidden places. Those who could not find shelter were consumed. For the monsters of the Carboniferous, their size was no shield. Even giants fell when the air itself became their enemy. The firestorms did not discriminate. They burned all life with equal force. When the flames died, silence returned. But the forest was gone. Towering trees had collapsed into blackened skeletons, and the swamp floor was buried in ash. The air hung heavy with smoke, glowing faintly in the dim light. For a time, the Carboniferous looked less like a jungle and more like a graveyard. Yet, even in ruin, life prepared to return. Shoots of green would rise through the ash, roots would push through the burned soil, and forests would grow once more. But each cycle of fire and regrowth weakened the balance. The monsters that had ruled here began to lose their grip. Something was shifting, and the age of giants was trembling at its foundations. The firestorms did more than burn. They broke the world itself. Towering trees that had stood for centuries toppled, their roots scorched, their crowns turned to ash. The canopy that once blocked the sun was gone, leaving emptiness where shadows had ruled. Without their cover, the swamp lost its balance. Animals fled. Insects died in countless numbers, and even the soil seemed to weaken. The giants of the Carboniferous began to decline. Their world, built on oxygen and endless forests, was crumbling under the weight of fire and collapse. But nature never rests in silence. From the ashes, new forms prepared to rise. Fragile amphibians had struggled, yet others were ready to take their place. Creatures with tougher skins, stronger lungs, and eggs that could survive without water. The world of fire and collapse had opened a door, and through it came a new kind of life. The reptiles. What would it mean for a land once ruled by insects to welcome creatures that no longer feared the dry air? The answer waits in the next chapter. From the ashes of the Carboniferous, new creatures emerged. Their skin was tougher, their bodies less fragile. Unlike amphibians, they did not depend on constant water. They carried their world within them, protected by scales and lungs built for the heavy air. These were the first reptiles, pioneers who found strength in the ruin of giants. Where firestorms had destroyed forests and monsters had fallen, reptiles began to claim the land. Silent, small, and resilient, they carried the promise of a new age in every cautious step they took. What gave reptiles their true power was not their skin, but their eggs. Unlike amphibians, whose young needed water, reptiles carried shells strong enough to survive on dry land. Each egg was a promise, a fortress of life against the dangers of the swamp. From these eggs, new generations spread farther from the water's edge, each hatchling a step deeper into the forest, a step into freedom. No longer bound to swamps, reptiles unlocked a world closed to those before them. Their eggs were more than birth. They were the keys to survival on land. As reptiles grew stronger, the balance of power shifted. Insects still ruled the air, and amphibians still clung to water. But reptiles walked freely, moving with independence that no other creature possessed. They were no longer trapped between two worlds. They were masters of their own. Each scale was armor, each breath a shield against the harsh air. They hunted quietly, endured the heat, and thrived where others perished. The Carboniferous was changing, and in its change, reptiles became the symbols of resilience. Silent heirs to a land scarred by fire and shadow. Reptiles carried freedom in their very bodies. They no longer needed to return to water. Their lungs were stronger, their skin was armor, and their eggs held life safe from the swamp. Step by step, they spread beyond the edges of the wetlands. Into the forests they went, across roots and ash, into places amphibians could not follow. They were small still, but they were bold. Each movement was the start of a journey that would lead to deserts, mountains, and distant continents. The reptiles had claimed a future larger than the swamps that birthed them. The reign of insects was ending. Fire had weakened their forests, and reptiles now walked where they could not. The world was shifting, and with every hatchling, reptiles pressed further into the land. But what would it mean for creatures once trapped in water to now rule the dry earth? How would this new kingdom shape the ages to come? The answer lies ahead in the next chapter. Even now, millions of years later, the Carboniferous whispers through us. Our fear of spiders, of scorpions, of things that crawl in the dark, may be echoes of a time when those creatures ruled the world. The sight of too many legs, the shimmer of webs, the sudden buzz of wings. They stir something ancient inside us. Perhaps these are not random fears, but memories buried deep in our blood. We carry the shadows of our ancestors, who once walked in swamps where every step was danger. When we shiver at the touch of a spider's thread, we remember a forest of silk stretched across the night. When we jump at the hiss of wings, we recall skies once filled with dragonflies larger than hawks. The giants of the Carboniferous are gone. Their forests burned, their air thinned, their reign ended. Yet in every corner of our world, their descendants still remain. Small spiders weave webs in gardens, dragonflies skim across ponds, scorpions hide under stones. They are tiny shadows of a lost age, fragments of a time when they were kings. It is humbling to think. The mighty rulers of that world are now small enough to be brushed aside. Yet they endure, still alive, still adapting. Survivors in miniature, carrying the memory of their ancient empire. And when we look at them closely, we glimpse the history of life itself, how power rises, and how even giants must one day fade. The Carboniferous reminds us that air itself shapes life, that balance is fragile, and when it shifts, entire worlds can be born or destroyed. Too much oxygen bred monsters. Too much fire ended their reign. The story of the Carboniferous is the story of balance lost and found again. Today, as we change our own atmosphere, these lessons return. The creatures of the Carboniferous teach us that climate is not just background, it is destiny. When the air changes, so does life. The question is not whether the world will endure. It always has. The question is whether we will adapt as life once did, or vanish as the giants of old. If this journey through the forgotten forests has touched you, share it with someone who loves the quiet mysteries of the past. Sharing helps these calm stories find others who long to drift into history's shadows before sleep. The Carboniferous is gone, but its echoes remain in fear, in memory, in every breath we take. And beyond this age of fire and giants, greater stories still await. The rise of reptiles, the fall of empires, the long march of time itself. Our next step lies deeper into the forgotten pages of Earth's story, and I invite you to walk there with me.